All right, continuing our story of the digestive pathway, we've made our way down through the esophagus, and food will then be dumped into the stomach. The stomach has two jobs: one to mechanically digest food, and the other to chemically digest food. So we are going to have the stomach muscles helping mix the food with the digestive juices, uh, helping mechanically break it down, and then we're going to release chemicals to help with chemical digestion. So there's going to be some enzymes and acids to help break down food into smaller and smaller pieces. The mechanical digestion, again, is going to be done by the muscle layers. There are 3 layers of smooth muscle. So again, smooth muscle, you don't have control of it. It's automatically going to work in this digestion of the food. And those 3 layers are all going to wrap around the stomach in different directions. So the muscle fibers will be running in different planes. And then we have gastric glands in the lining of the stomach. And those glands have different cells that release different substances, like, again, acids and different enzymes to help start chemically digesting the food. In lab, you guys are going to discuss the different parts of the stomach, so we can quickly look at it right now, but again, you're going to see this in the stomach, and these will be things that are fair game on prosections and in the donors. So this is our picture of the stomach. We have the esophagus, again, bringing food down, dumping the food into the stomach, and we have the wall cut open to where we can see that there are muscle fibers running in different directions. So we have a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and an oblique layer. And if you imagine the stomach is this bag for mixing the food with chemicals, we would want muscle fibers running in different directions so that we can really mix everything up very well. It kind of reminds me, if you've ever taken a Ziploc baggie and put in your icing and food coloring to give your icing color. If you have the icing and the food coloring, you're not just going to squish the bag in one direction and keep squeezing the same spot over and over. You're going to really squeeze in different directions and angles to really mix the icing with the food coloring to get everything colored nice and even. Same kind of idea. We're really trying to mix everything with the digestive juices in the stomach as well as we can. Parts of the stomach that are going to be helpful to know, between the esophagus and the stomach, we are going to have a sphincter right here called the cardiac sphincter, because where the location of the stomach sits in your left upper quadrant of the abdomen, somewhat right under where your heart is situated in your body. And the other reason they call it cardiac sphincter is because sometimes it doesn't work so great and acid can leave the stomach and come up into the esophagus, giving you that feeling of heartburn. Right? So your heart's not actually burning or anything going on with the heart. It's the acid is causing some damage to the lining of your esophagus. So cardiac sphincter, we can also call that the lower esophageal sphincter. Both names are acceptable. We typically use cardiac sphincter more often in our lab, but you can call it, again, either one. And that sphincter in lab, we'll put a pin right here and ask ID structure. Right? There's another sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, at the other end of the stomach. And the job of these sphincters is to keep things in the stomach until we're ready for it to move through the digestive tract. So the pyloric sphincter and cardiac sphincter are typically contracted, keeping those openings closed, which is useful for mixing stuff here in the stomach. We don't want it leaking out of the stomach into the small intestine or back up into the esophagus. It's like back to the Ziploc baggie with your icing and your food coloring. If you put that in intending to mix the icing with the food coloring, you don't leave the Ziploc baggie unzipped so that when you squeeze, everything just oozes out. You zip it up so everything stays in your Ziploc baggie. same idea here. The pyloric sphincter and cardiac sphincter are your zippers. So we're going to zipper it shut when we're mixing stuff in the stomach. And then when it's time, the stuff has been mixed very well, we can open the pyloric sphincter and allow the digestive materials to move into the small intestine. Some regions that are going to be useful in the lab, we have the fundic region of the stomach. We've learned the fundus of other organ. So in lab, if we tag the stomach up here at the very top, it's kind of dome-shaped region, and ask ID region, we're going to expect you to say of what organ, and I'll put in parentheses on the exam, include of what organ. So ID region, include of what organ. We have the fundus, we have the body of the stomach, this majority middle part. We have the pyloric region of the stomach, close by the pyloric sphincter. We also have a cardiac region close to our cardiac sphincter. So up here, the cardiac sphincter is not very strong. It's not a very thick muscle that's really identifiable. So to be clear, if we're looking for a cardiac sphincter versus a cardiac region, the sphincters we're going to ask is identify the structure where cardiac region or fundus, body, pyloric region, all of those will be identify the region of what organ. All right, so with our pathway, we have the food coming down the esophagus. It's going to pass through the cardiac sphincter into the cardiac region, down into the body to the pyloric region, and eventually out the pyloric sphincter to the small intestine. With the stomach, we have histology. If you are 3120, you need to know that the stomach is lined with simple columnar epithelium. So simple, we have one layer of cells. Columnar, those cells are tall and narrow, so column or rectangular in shape. And this type of epithelial tissue is useful for secretion and absorption. And in the case of the stomach, we're going to be doing a lot more secretion than we are absorbing any nutrients. With the lining, it's not a pretty smooth lining of the simple columnar epithelium. It's actually going to form tons of tiny little microscopic pits, or little pores, and those are called gastric pits. And then at the very bottom of those pits, we're going to have a collection of specialized cells that come together, and they're called gastric glands. So the gastric glands are way down in the lining of the stomach. They're producing gastric juices, which is going to be a mixture of acid and enzymes. And then that gastric juice is going to come up through the gastric pits and enter the stomach. So again, the gastric glands are producing acid. So the inside of your stomach is actually very, very acidic, 1.5 to 3.5 on the pH scale. So very, very low pH. Which is great for in the stomach, but anywhere else in our body, that would be a terrible thing to have. So very acidic, and it's actually useful for one of the products of our gastric gland. One of our cells produces something called pepsinogen, and that pepsinogen is released into the stomach, but it's not active. It can't do anything. So to activate pepsinogen, we need the acid, and it creates pepsin, an active enzyme that can help with breaking down proteins. So Dr. Ratucci is going to get into that. That's more physiology, but know that the acid in the stomach is important for digestion. So these gastric glands, again, are made of a collection of cells. And in the lab, we're going to be able to identify the cells. We do have histology slides of showing the different cells. And then Dr. Tucci is going to talk about what each of those cells produces. So the ones we're going to look at in the lab, we have mucus cells. You can about guess what those are going to make. They make mucus. We have parietal cells that make something called intrinsic factor, as well as the HCl or acid that's being emptied into the stomach. We have chief cells producing the pepsinogen, and then some endocrine cells that we can see in our slides. Again, what it's making, that's all physiology, and you'll get to that with Dr. Tucci, and then you'll talk about what those products do for the digestive tract. So what we're going to do right now is we're back to the stomach and we're going to zoom in on just a little piece. So we're taking the wall and we're going to zoom in so that we can see the lining of the stomach. We'll be able to see the simple columnar epithelium. We'll see the pits and the glands. All right, so we took a chunk out of the stomach. That's what we're looking at. This side would be the inside of the stomach where food's passing through or mixing foods with gastric juices. Lining the stomach, we have cells, these simple columnar cells. And again, it's not just smooth straight across. Those cells dip down in and form pits. So this is a gastric pit. And all the way at the bottom, we have a whole collection of specialized cells forming our gastric glands. Further out, we do see that we have these muscle layers. So again, we have smooth muscle to help us with mixing the gastric juices with the food. If you're 3120, this slide is similar to one that you will see in lab. We have exactly where it transitions from the esophagus to the stomach, and it's a very abrupt change. So I'm going to draw a little dotted line here. Food would be passing through this spot where my arrow is. So this is the empty hollow area for food to pass through. We're going through the esophagus. We see epithelial tissue lining the esophagus. So all of this is connective tissue. We have a basement membrane right here. And then we have epithelial tissue. We have it's stratified cells at the top are flatter. So stratified squamous epithelium lining the esophagus, transition, and then we get into the stomach. And it's a very, very different looking place histologically. So we have simple columnar epithelium and it's dipping down, making these pits. So this is the gastric pit coming down. This is where the gastric juices are filling. Here's our basement membrane. So we have from the basement membrane to this empty space for gastric juices, 1 cell thick, and they're tall and thin. So simple columnar epithelium. So we have labeled stratified squamous epithelium, and this side simple columnar. The gastric pits dipping down, and then we'll again at the bottom have specialized cells forming our gastric glands. This image, we are in the stomach, so we're at the wall. This side, we have a lot of gastric juices out here, stuff being mixed with food. So this is the space where food fills, and we have the gastric pit. So there's a gastric pit, there's a gastric pit. Lining those gastric pits, so you can see the simple columnar epithelium. So here's our basement membrane, here's our free surface of the cells. So 1 cell thick, tall, and thin. So simple columnar epithelium. And the cells that we see lining the gastric pits, these cells are called mucus cells. And this slide is stained specifically to stain the mucus in the cell. So what these cells do is produce mucus. So you might have been asking yourself, stratified squamous epithelium is for protection. In the stomach, we have a very, very strong acid. It is 1.5 to 3.5 on the pH scale. How is that acid not eating our lining away and killing us? The only thing that is saving you from the acid eating through your stomach wall is these mucus cells producing an alkaline mucus to protect themselves. So these cells are constantly producing mucus. They do wear down fast, so this is a place that there is a high turnover of cells. So we make lots and lots of new cells every, I think, few days. And then as we move down through the pit, we get down to the gastric glands, and it just looks like a whole bunch of pink and purple through up here. So we have these pink cells. So we see a nucleus with pink cytoplasm. There's a nucleus, pink cytoplasm. Here's a really good one, nucleus, pink cytoplasm. These are parietal cells. Here's another one, nucleus, pink cytoplasm. Parietal cells are the ones producing the acid for the stomach. Alright, so that acid is going to come up through these pits and mix with the food that you're trying to digest. So that's coming from these pink parietal cells. And then we're going to go a little further down into the gastric gland. We still see those parietal cells, but now we have more cells that we can see. We have chief cells. So chief cells are purple. We have nucleus, purple cytoplasm. Nucleus, purple cytoplasm. Here's one, nucleus, purple cytoplasm. So you see tons and tons and tons of these chief cells all over. Alright, so those are producing the pepsinogen, but again, that's a Bertocci thing. And then we have our pretty pink cells with the nucleus, pink cytoplasm. Alright, so very pretty pink cells. You'll have a similar slide in your notes to label. And then the last cell we can see is our endocrine cell, or some places it's labeled enteroendocrine cell. Either one's fine. Endocrine cell's easier, so that's probably the one I'd stick with, but if you want to write it all out, enteroendocrine, that's great. With these cells, what we see is the nucleus. So you see a nucleus, but around it, it looks like a white halo. You don't see cytoplasm colored. So there's no pink or purple surrounding the nucleus. It just looks empty. So there's an endocrine cell right here. Here's another one, nucleus, white halo around it. Here's another nucleus, white halo. So these, again, endocrine cells. Moving from the stomach, the digested food that we've just mixed with gastric juices is going to dump into the small intestine. So our next video will be focused on the small intestine and what's going on there.